Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our EUROCONTROL Stakeholder Forum strategic webinar on higher airspace operations. Today, we're going to talk about what needs to be done to safely accommodate the growing higher airspace operations industry, as well as putting in place proper coordination mechanisms between air traffic management and space traffic management. So higher airspace operations is probably one of the most interesting and fast evolving airspace challenges. And over the last decade, a wide range of new and future vehicles looking to operate in higher airspace, that is the region between the airspace used by conventional aircraft and the beginning of space, have started to emerge. So from slowly moving unmanned balloons, airships, high altitude, long endurance aircraft, so-called HAPS, to fast-moving supersonic and hypersonic aircraft, or transatmospheric and suborbital vehicles, the whole field of higher airspace operations is being boosted by technological innovation as operators look to exploit new commercial opportunities. So in addition, there is the challenge of also commercial and state space operations, which also want to transit through higher airspace when launching and returning to Earth. So managing this incredible airspace user mix comprising unmanned, piloted, fast and slow-moving vehicles requires a robust operational and regulatory framework. So to help us to explore some of the key questions around HAO, including the challenge of integrating this space traffic management with classic air traffic management, we put together an expert panel from across the higher airspace operations value chain. So today, I'm delighted to introduce you to our panelists: Marco Caparici, Special Advisor for Space Transportation to the Director of Human and Robotic Exploration at the European Space Agency; Giovanni Di Antonio, Director of Technology Innovation at ENAC, which is the Italian Civil Aviation Authority; and Dragos Tonia, who is the head of ENEO, the Integration of New Entrants in the European ATM Network Operations, and also the CESAR ECHO 2 Project Manager from EUROCONTROL. So each panelist will make a short presentation just to share their perspective on the topic, and then I will open the floor to a question and answer session for which we've already received a large number of questions. So you can use the Q&A function to send in your questions. If you're experiencing any technical issues, please use the chat function, which you can see on the slide. So without any further ado, I'd like to give the floor to our first speaker, Marco Caparici, Special Advisor to the Space Transportation for Director and Robotic Exploration of the European Space Agency. Marco, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Philip. And good morning, good afternoon to everybody, ladies and gentlemen. I have the task to introduce this debate, and I would like to do it by, let's say, trying to set up the scenario of the many applications that are developing, and which, of course, exhibit all a series of different requirements and conditions for their implementation. So let me start immediately. I think it will help in setting indeed the scenario. So I've divided, if you want, the space applications. I'm looking at that coming from our responsibility of space activities, and see how these could affect the airspace conventional and extended, of course, as it will be required by some new applications. So I start with the classic space missions. In particular, we know since the 70s the success of the geostationary satellites, mainly for television and telecommunications. And for this, the interaction with the airspace, and you see I've taken an indication of 20 kilometers. This has no, absolutely no regulatory value, so it is more kind of technological distinction. Since the inception, the geostationary satellites have been launched to a geostationary transfer orbit, and therefore their interaction with the airspace has been very limited, just crossing the airspace to go to the final destination, which is the geostationary orbit. And their end of life was achieved by raising their orbit into a stable, not used orbit, for which there could be no collision of among the satellites in this graveyard orbit. There's been then the extension to polar orbiting satellites, mainly for Earth observation. And there, the first problems arise with the need for the orbiting at the end of the life of the satellite, which requires, of course, knowing very well what amount of propellant is still available on board. And that could generate an interaction both with the air traffic and the ship traffic, assuming that one will seek for a re-entry area over the ocean. Launch systems, we see a clear evolution, going from traditional launchers, which were flying something like maximum 10 missions per year, to reusable launchers, and which will have a much higher frequency. But launch systems in general were solved with the interaction with the airspace was solved with two, let's say, measures. One was the removal of all launcher-related objects, in particular the upper stage, from orbit, and of course a closure of the airspace around the launch zone at the time of the launch. Human space flight, special applications. For the classic area, this has been low Earth orbit, the International Space Station, with again a traffic which was in, say, we can count in a few flights per month, or the moon missions of the 60s. All these, they had also very limited interaction with airspace, because essentially was for the re-entry in the Earth atmosphere, so crossing the atmosphere in a relatively short time frame. Now, what we begin to see instead is an evolution of many of these missions, and in particular, we see the satellite constellations which are coming up. And most of them are in low Earth orbit. That means that any failure will lead to a very fast re-entry, and the risk of having an interaction with other satellites, a collision, therefore multiplying the number of debris in orbit. Therefore, there is a need for the orbiting measures, and possibly the international organizations, as well as the national authorities for spaceflight, are looking also the possibility to create a regulation in this sense, which would be, of course, maybe it's difficult to find an agreement, but it's is a need which is absolutely recognized. I was saying reusable launchers is the next novel element. The number of flights for these vehicles is clearly increasing, because the profitability of the reusable launcher comes only if the flight rate increases. And so we go from, as we said, 10 flights a year to something like 100 flights a year and growing. And that means, of course, there are definitely we are facing an increase of the interaction with the air traffic, in particular, not only during the launch, which is still solved with the closure of the temporary closure of the airspace, but in particular with the re-entry, where we have stages coming back from, if not from orbit, at least for the moment, from high levels of the atmosphere with high speed, not really re-entry, but Mach 5, Mach 6, which also, of course, requires checking the interaction, monitoring the interaction with possible air traffic and excluding interferences. The new element which is appearing in the last few years is the development of commercial low Earth orbit infrastructure to succeed the International Space Station. This has been encouraged very much by the US government, and it represents, if you want, an enabling condition for the space agencies like NASA and ESA to take care to move their investments to exploration. Therefore, we're going to the mission to go back to the moon and later on to Mars. This is achieved by transferring the responsibility for low Earth orbit activities to the commercial sector. And this would imply that there will be a number of competing entities setting up commercial activities. Of course, there are some enabling conditions that need to be satisfied by the government, but we see that there are already several competent companies proposing the creation of commercial infrastructure in low Earth orbit. This would increase the rate, not dramatically in the sense that we're still talking of flying through the atmosphere, so it's a short duration at the launch, and it may imply re-entry of capsules, bringing back results of experiments. Again, this would be probably, at least in the beginning, a few flights per year. While very successfully, another area is starting, which is the one of the suborbital crew flights, space tourism. This was somehow unexpected, but it has been proposed, and we see that there is at the moment quite a lot of demand. These are short duration flights, mainly. Of course, there are also flights to the orbital infrastructure, but what is supposed to be very attractive for the so-called space tourists would be the access to the microgravity environment for a limited time, because not many of the space tourists are ready to suffer the burden of the staying in orbit for several months. Finally, we have future applications, which are at the moment very much debated, but they're still under, say, conception phase. We have mega constellations with really thousands of satellites, both in LEO orbit, in intermediate orbit, highly elliptical, or also geostationary. And for these, there will be the need for an active deorbiting to avoid the interaction among satellites and with the airspace. There is the area of high-speed transport and weapon delivery, which is coming back first for cargo and I would say military applications, but possibly also for crew. This is mainly for the purpose of intercontinental suborbital flight. So it will be mainly in the atmosphere. So it could be if this regime of flight finds finally application and success, the number of flights could be a very large one. So it will be a large interaction with the other air and space applications. Finally, in the longer term, there is the possibility of mining resources outside the Earth. That means typically using resources from the Moon and from Mars to enable the exploration missions without carrying all these required elements from Earth. This is, of course, corresponds to a mature scenario of exploration, and therefore it is already being considered, but it's still far from the moment of being implementation. Okay, I think my time is getting to the end, so I will like to thank you for your attention, and I remain open to answer your specific questions.
Thanks, Marco. That's a great oversight in terms of how things are developing and how complex they're starting to become. So that's really good. So at this stage, I'll hand the floor over to Giovanni to talk about ENAC's perspective, both from a regulatory and a spaceport point of view.
Thank you, Phil. Now I have the task to talk about the boring part of the webinar regarding regulation. And I would say that in this year, we are seeing a change of paradigm in the airspace transportation, because we see that typical operations that in the past were carried out by states now are carried out or want to be carried out by private commercial operators that want to play on the market. And there is also the need for a state to gain experience and for authorities to gain experience on that operation. So there is an urgency to operate this kind of operation starting from now. This is why the regulatory framework has to provide a framework of certainty in order to ensure safety and environmental sustainability, especially when airspace operations and traditional aviation traffic are expected to grow continuously in the future. Then we have to ensure a fair and equitable access to the airspace, because we know it is a limited shared resources, and all these by safeguarding the safety and the security and defense issues of the overflow states. But which are the main challenges in doing that? First of all, you mentioned, Phil, we have a huge variety of vehicles and operation to deal with. Then we have at least two different and sometimes conflicting regulatory regime that are in principle applicable to that operations. I mean, the air law and the space law. Then we should understand which kind of level of safety to assign to these diverse types of operations, which are the main responsibilities, or which is the sharing of responsibilities in terms of rulemaking, authorization, oversight, and investigation among different authorities, especially in Europe, where these kind of things are shared between Europe, European Union, and member states. Then we have a lot of other issues, like, for example, liability and insurance issues, but also the need to authorize and let global operations, when we know that at the beginning this kind of operation will be authorized at national level. Then we have the issue of, for example, of the integrating airspace traffic management and space traffic management and air traffic management, and where space traffic management is not well regulated yet for the time being. So which kind of tool we can use to deal with this complexity? We cannot rely on the traditional way of rulemaking on doing regulation. In the past, you spent years to write a certification standard that was expected to last a decade. Now it is not possible, because if we use years to write a standard, you know, it will become out of date very soon. So now the regulation has to be tackled by applying, first of all, the functionalist approach, because we cannot regulate based on the altitude, but based on the scope of the operation, that allow us to overcome the problem of the absence of the limitation between the airspace and the outer space that we know will not be easy to solve either in the future. Then the regulation must be risk-based and performance-based in order to define high-level objective requirements able to be applied to a variety of architecture and different kinds of vehicle. Think about, for example, the suborbital case in the United States. You know that Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin both are suborbital vehicles, completely different, but regulated by the same piece of regulation. I mean, the Part 450 from the FAA. So here you can see the importance of the performance-based regulation. Then regulation must be adaptive in order to follow the evolution of the technology, must be cooperative, developed in cooperation with the stakeholder. And finally, possibly should make use of the regulatory sandbox tool that will allow to test prototype regulation in a safe and controlled environment. That's the tool, but what to do with this kind of tool? We have, at general level, 4 areas to be covered in a very high level in the regulation. First of all, we should regulate the access and use of the airspace, safeguarding the sovereignty of the state, but also trying to implement those innovative concepts coming from the CONOPS, for example, from the EUROCONTROL. The EUROCONTROL provide us, suggest us, recommend us to implement the 4D operating zone. There, we should understand how to define them, how to define the sizing, how to let them to evolve, which are the responsibilities of the service provider that provides services inside this zone, and which are the new tasks and responsibilities of the air navigation service provider in order to separate IFR traffic from that zone. So there are new elements to be included into the airspace regulation that, of course, have to be built on the existing ICAO and regional regulation. And then another area, of course, is the area of the operation. We have a variety of different how vehicles and operations. We should classify them and try to regulate them in a modular way in order to authorize different operations with different set of regulation. And then we have a transversal area that should cover, for example, design and production. This is something that may be applied to every kind of aerospace operations. And finally, the 4th area is the infrastructure. I mean, for example, the ground infrastructure in terms of spaceports, but also tracking and surveillance infrastructure. One important element of the regulation, of course, are the levels of safety. We have said that, okay, we can have different levels of safety, but in any case, we should ensure and should protect, first of all, the occupants on board the vehicles, and the third parties on the ground, in the air, and in space. But in order to do so, we can, in my personal opinion, we cannot apply a single level of safety for every types of aerospace operations. Rather, we should follow the well-known continuous safety approach, or safety continuum approach, that where the level of safety are different for different kind of aircraft, which is the case for and operation, which is the case, for example, in the traditional manned aviation, where the general aviation level of safety is different from the large aircraft commercial air transport operations. And so each operation, each aerospace operation should be a proper level of safety. The difficulty is to identify it and to, let me say, share the safety budget among not only on the vehicle, but on the entire house systems in order to achieve the wanted level of safety. So the way forward, what can we do starting from now? I said we have an urgency to operate. And we have to classify, we have to subdivide operations and to distinguish. In Europe, also according to the EASA roadmap, we can subdivide airspace operations in 3 macro categories. For example, those operations which are clearly aviation, for example, supersonic flight, continuous air breathing, hypersonic flight, or HAPS. They are aviation operations that may be regulated in principle by applying the current regulatory framework, aviation regulatory framework, possibly with some modification. Then we have another category of operation, which are the clearly space operations. I mean, the vertical launch into orbit and the re-entry from orbit. That's, of course, are operations that fall under the responsibility of the states and will be authorized by the state. Then we have a third categories of airspace operations, which are called the hybrid, because they contain some element that could be associated with the aircraft, but it is debatable whether or not they could fall under the air law or the space law. I'm referring, for example, to the suborbital flight and to the air launching into orbit for the aviation part. So in my opinion, probably this will be a matter of choice of the states and the regulators whether or not to encompass them within the air law or the space law. But nevertheless, in order to start deploying this operation in Europe, probably we should start by accommodating the clearly aviation, the operations which are clearly aviation in case by case. Then we can continue to research and study on aerospace operations, but most importantly, we should allow from now commercial space transportation and hybrid operation to be deployed and to be authorized by the states under the national regulation and possibly based on bilateral and multilateral agreement that will ensure possible interoperability, because this has the aim to gather information, data, and experience that will serve to start trying to build regulatory, let me say, a regional or international regulatory framework from the data and from the experience by applying a bottom-up approach from moving from national to regional to international level, at least in some important elements, like, for example, the access and use of airspace. As a matter of fact, notwithstanding the fact who will be in charge to regulate a specific airspace operations or vehicle, there is the need to define a minimum set of common requirement, uniform requirements to allow the safe accommodation and integration of the airspace in operations in the aerospace. And in this regard, I think that ICAO, which has introduced the aerospace operations within the new entrant, will play an important role for in the future for discussing, for gathering best practices, and also possibly to develop standard and recommended practices or procedure for navigation services for those international aerospace operations carried out by aerospace aircraft that clearly fall into the provision, within the provision of the Chicago Convention. So it's a path, it's a bottom-up approach, and but we can start now to go in that direction. Thank you.
Thanks, Giovanni. Very comprehensive overview of the regulatory environment. So Dragos, from a network management research perspective, floor is yours.
Thank you, Philippe. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like that by the end of my introduction to you, in the next 5 minutes, you will have retained 3 key elements that the network manager considers a priority for higher airspace operations, and a short but comprehensive overview of what I think is the most exciting and most ambitious research project in higher airspace operations, namely ECO2. Firstly, why do we speak about the network manager in this context? It has to do with the way Europe airspace is organized. A collection of sovereign member states that manage individually their airspace will simply not be suitable and competitive in higher airspace operations. This has been understood for a very long time in the aviation system of Europe, not because higher airspace operations just emerged, but because this is a problem where we're looking at making airspace efficient, safe, accessible in a manner that's equitable and fair and transparent to everyone. In that sense, I'm slowly hinting to you that the network manager considers for the launch and re-entries phase, the airspace as a critical resource to be managed, shared, and planned for between 2 distinct communities, the space community and the aviation community. But from our perspective, this is yet another class of airspace users. We're looking to find ways whereby the existing framework that underpins network managers' obligations, responsibilities in cooperation with member states, service providers, industry, civil and military authorities is expanded in a manner that's reasonably understood, practical, to include a new category of airspace user for higher airspace operations. We like to call this a single planning process, and emphasis on the single. We understand, as Giovanni has highlighted, that there are two regulatory regimes, and there is a portion of this potential airspace users that could fall under a different regime. But in practical terms, we're all just a community that's trying to share the airspace. We can ill afford to have our transportation network impacted in a manner which is disproportionate to the benefits that we think we're going to extract from being competitive in commercial space launches. But equally, we want to make sure that Europe sends a very strong signal that it's open for business, and its mechanisms and its way of doing operations are equally on the par with the most advanced systems that you see in big national states like colleagues from the United States and other regions of the world. So how do we do this planning of airspace? We have some very tried and tested processes, but they're really geared towards a static planning. We have long lead times. We have a mechanism that invites states to plan on their own with their own priorities. The airspace utilization and reservation plan, to which the network manager then compiles all this data, does impact assessments, and then provides feedback and offers the best solutions that would maximize efficiency, but most importantly, would maintain safety in network operations. It's obvious to us that while the process has the backbone and the framework, which we think is robust enough to accommodate this new class of airspace, there are specific requirements, and I think we acknowledge that there might be business demands from the space community whereby they might need different lead times. They might have specific areas where we will need to fine-tune our current processes. What I'd like to make it clear during this webinar is that the network manager is fully engaged in this already, making sure that its working arrangements, its consultation at operational level is done in a manner that's proactive. Just as an example, we've opened the door to expand the definitions of what it is an approved agency. This is an entity that the state deems authorized to have a say in what kind of airspace requirements it has. For us, it's easy to consider the entire range of member states that are involved in this type of analysis and make the claim that each state would have its own strategic priority. And it is obvious to us that by allowing them to prioritize between space and aviation and include all civil and military demands in this single planning process, we will be in a very strong position to have some solid grounding to which we can plan forward for efficient use of airspace. The second part, which is the reentry, is again very interesting. I'm sure the headlines have been read by most of the participants to the webinar. When you had uncontrolled reentries, what's happening, how do we deal with this? But before I move to that, which is part of the contingency management, the second topic of interest to the network manager, let me just highlight that we also have operational scenarios of controlled reentries. We envisage a future where this would become more and more a part of our daily operations. And in there, we also need to have mechanisms that move beyond the static planning of the airspace to a more dynamic planning of the airspace. You've already heard from Giovanni early on the term 4D operating zones. This is a very smart and logical concept of using dynamic management of airspace around vehicles, be they low speed or high speed, such that the way we are reserving and then releasing the airspace back to be used by the rest of the community is far more dynamic, and therefore the impact on and the cost of accommodating these operations is proportionate to the benefits that they accrue. The second item that's important for the network manager is really contingency management. In high-speed scenarios, it's obvious to us that the response from a single member state is at best limited, simply because of the physics of such contingency scenario. Either it's a non-nominal event at the launch, and then you may end up with having a a debris field that spans cross-border, or you might have an uncontrolled re-entry. And on this latter, I need not remind you that an uncontrolled re-entry has triggered airspace closure in a manner that we looked into it and thought as an area that we can improve. Therefore, we're thinking that the current processes where EUROCONTROL supports the European Aviation Crisis Coordination Cell and what the network manager does in coordination with states, civil and military authorities, service provider, can and should be improved in a manner that's proportionate and responding to these very specific challenges. The notion of being just a regional solution doesn't really work. That leads me to the third priority for us. All this needs to be international because we're going to be sharing information with partners that operate from other regions, but re-entries would come from doesn't matter where, so our region needs to be prepared. With that, I would like to highlight that these particular topics sit at the core of ECO2 project. This is a initiative that was launched in the aftermath of a successful conclusion of the operational concept of operations for higher airspace, referenced earlier as the EcoConops, one of the pillars for ICAO to build on a global harmonizations and future development of standard recommended practices and procedures for air navigation services. But more importantly, because I don't think we've covered enough the low speed operations and high altitude platform system, we're looking at this project to provide under the guise and the protection of smart airspace management solution, be they static or dynamic, the safe space where more advanced solutions for collision avoidance, provision of services in terms of notification, weather forecasts, so on and so forth, is firmly allowed to evolve at an exponential growth rate, because we think that there are solutions out there that could be, if not complementary, then even better than what we currently have in the ATM system. So just remember, we have 25 partners. Every major ANSP in Europe is part of this project. Space colleagues are involved into it. We are boasting to have a launch from High Impulse in Saxaford. We're looking to build a prototype that's going to get space data and inject that in network manager systems and see how we can test contingency scenarios, share that information with service providers. And I have the pleasure to work with Giovanni as part of this project, where he will be leading the work that covers the national, local perspective, and the network manager will provide an equally important view from the network, such that by the end of the project, anybody who's looking to understand how operations in higher airspace are implemented in Europe can look at ECO2 and understand the building blocks. Will this be a complete validation of the concept? By no means, no, there's more to come. But in terms of what is absolutely necessary to happen from an ATM perspective, you will get results that would make certain that ATO in Europe is a reality. And last but not least, I want to acknowledge that in the area of high altitude platform systems, we will have 2 flight trials, one run by Airbus Zephyr, the second one by Skydweller in Grottaglia in Italy. Airbus Zephyr will take off from the United States, cross the Atlantic, Santa Maria, Portugal, Spain, France, descend to Italy, back to the Mediterranean, and back to the United States, not once landing in Europe and giving us this particular much sought after real-time data that can inform our decisions, how we simulate and how we build this for the operating zones. I think it's very exciting, and I'm looking forward to addressing any questions that the audience might have in this topic. Thank you, Philip.
Thanks, Dragos. So we covered quite a lot of ground there. So let me just pick on a couple of topics. A lot of questions coming in about the international dimension. So Neil Wolf from McGill, for instance, says that different organizations such as FAA, EASA, CANSO, Eurocontrol, we've all issued policy papers, we've initiated programs. How can we get more joined up thinking, given that space is it's a shared resource in terms of doing that? So how could that alignment piece work? Marco, over to you first.
Yes, thanks. We are working, of course, now since decades with NASA and the other international partners of the space station And so what we have learned there is that we started from a situation where each of the partner had its own solution, and we're trying to evolve into a situation where we favor, for example, interoperability, commonality in terms of vehicle elements and operations. And one element there for us, again, that is from the technical point of view, is to enforce a certain standardization of a number of important functions and interfaces, so that at international level we can indeed have interoperability during missions and cope with contingency cases. Different is the case, of course, of regulations, and that is indeed another area where the responsible agencies have to come up and provide a result. So I would leave that to the colleagues for a complementary answer.
Giovanni, what's your thoughts on the international dimension?
Yes, of course. The cooperation, international cooperation is a goal. And I would say that in the past, the topic was addressed by carry out bilateral agreements, especially with the FAA. So many, for example, European states entered into a memorandum of cooperation with the United States in order to develop their own regulatory framework. But recently, before the pandemic in 2019, the European Commission and Europe has decided to guide the initiative, and as everybody knows, asked EASA to carry out a preparatory work for the future European regulation on aerospace operation, a Eurocontrol, to define the concept of operation. So from that initiative, the AUTAS Force Airspace, the EASA AUTAS Force worked in a strict cooperation with EUROCONTROL and ECHO. So we had these two coordination at the European level that in this period is expanding at the international level with the conversation and the discussion within ICAO with the United States. So it is the bottom-up approach. You see states start because they have interest to operate, but then it is a growing agreement and cooperation effort at regional level and then at international level. It's a process that started and not finished yet. We have to continue, of course.
Okay. And Dragos, from the cooperation through the ECHO project in particular, I presume you have a strong view on that.
So there's two threads I'd like to cover. First one, the global one, where ICAO has launched this initiative in response to the resolution of Assembly 41st, where higher airspace operations were put at the forefront. In September, they had an event and World Shaping the Skies. And I think the panels there agreed that looking at the three solutions mentioned by Neil in his question, they're all predicated on airspace management as the staple for which this needs to happen, at least in the short to medium term. Therefore, the foundation is there to issue a state letter later on to invite states to participate and create a working structure that federates all these global resources. But more pragmatically, when we're looking through ECHO 2 and we're looking at colleagues that have developed these concepts like CANSA and in particular the FAA, I think we have a memorandum of cooperation and we're sharing research data with them. ECHO 2 is one of the pillars for providing this information from the European side, and I'm confident that by looking at the nuts and bolts that underpin each concept, we'll be able to find a common way forward. We already know there's differences, but I think we're even more confident that the commonality between these concepts is reason to be confident in the future.
Very good. And at a state level, we touched on this in terms of the coordination. How well advanced are we in terms of the state coordination? Maybe Dragos, you'll take that because I think you mentioned it in terms of the clearing arrangements.
Yeah, I think it's a very important aspect for the European region, because the way we're looking at handling the priorities between space and aviation domains in particular, these are now competing industry. We're not talking just about the state sanction missions in the space. We're looking at the commercial endeavors, and therefore there has to be an analysis from a business perspective, how that impacts every airspace users. And therefore, we are of the opinion that a state is the only one who's able to prioritize within its own national interest what kind of airspace planning would reflect these priorities. Equally, states are those who would be running the show at United Nations level. Let's all remember, it's not just ICAO. We have the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs. This is a very important part where we actually need to engage states and particularly organizations that are part of that process. And to me, it's clear that once we provide the technical solutions and we have this ability to explain logically how it functions, states need to have that leading role in cooperation with organizations like the European Union, Eurocontrol, United Nations. Thank you.
Okay. In terms of the infrastructure, Giovanni, I know that you're doing a lot of work in terms of spaceports. What kind of issues do you see arising from the infrastructure point of view as terms of enablers?
Of course, the ground infrastructure and the spaceport is the first enabler. If we want to operate, we have to have a spaceport to operate a ground infrastructure. And the ground infrastructure is part of the HAPS system and is part of the system that enable this kind of operation, but not only in terms of, let me say, physical infrastructure. The spaceport is the physical infrastructure, but also the organization and the provision of services, and it also has a huge impact on the territory because flight corridors to reach this landing site or takeoff site are much linked to the geography of the territory in terms of, for example, population density that may pose constraint to the kind of trajectory that could be used to enter and exiting. Another important piece of infrastructure is of course, the operation control center that is typically installed in the spaceport and where the operator monitor and control the operations and has to have a direct link with the ATM, in order to cope with emergency situation and have the clearance. But one important aspect in the future, when more than one operation will have to be operated in the spaceport, and when more operator will be in the spaceport, is the slot allocation. The spaceport has also to define, there is also the need to define the slot allocation management that takes into account the readability and availability of physical infrastructure that has to match in turn with the flight, with the launch windows provided by the STM, and with the minimization of the impact on the ATM network. So the spaceport, of course, this from a technical point of view. Then from an economic point of view, of course, the spaceport is the wheel that put in movement all the development of the sector in a territory.
Okay, very good. And probably this is a general question to everybody in terms of what are the security aspects in relation to this initiative. I know we've touched on safeties and safety levels. In terms of actual security, is there what's the perspective in relation to that? So Marco, how about you?
Yes. Okay. We have here we are assisting to an evolution, indeed, moving from space programs defined by the national agencies or international partners and the commercial world, and this is a major step. I don't think there is yet a final solution because, of course, safety and also security impact a lot the investment required by an entity to develop a certain type of activity. For example, we have implemented all the developments of the space station with the double redundancy. And we see now moving to exploration, moon, and looking even beyond, not always will be possible, first of all, to have the double redundancy implemented because of performance issues, but in particular, will not be possible because of financial implications in having to adopt such measures systematically on the board of the spacecraft. So there is a debate which is not finalized yet on what exactly are the functions which need to ensure full double redundancy or single redundancy, and others where we can, based on lessons learned and progress made in operations, we can relax perhaps the requirements.
So, Dragos, from a network management point of view, I'm sure you spoke a little bit about the risk assessment before in terms of security. What's the network manager's perspective on this?
So for us in our operations, the military cooperation is something in our DNA. We are looking to expand this to this new class of higher airspace operations. We have to remember that the state's responsibilities when it comes to air defense and security are unchanged. There is a difference in the legal regime, of course, between national sovereign airspace and outer space. That's acknowledged, but the reality is that when it comes to preparing for these operations, we can ill afford to have scenarios where we are looking to find a tactical solution to something which is a very high-speed scenario, or we have no idea who's operating in our airspace with a low, long endurance platform. So to me, that's a crucial aspect. I also want to throw in the fact that there may be operators moving on to operate from high seas. That adds to the challenge who's going to be in charge of that. The situation is such that I think we need to have a serious reflection process. Use the principle, yes, but add to them the content and the specifics that would make it suitable for 21st century and an HAO. Thank you.
Yeah. And Giovanni, then in the context, given what Dragos was saying in terms of the way in which the airspace is going to be managed, this 4D trajectory piece where it's going to be a new concept of operations, that obviously really does throw in some interesting regulatory challenges in terms of how that works. How closely aligned, you were talking about a risk-based assessment model, how can you model that in a very rapid period of time?
Let me say that I mentioned the need to regulate the new concept of operations, and the regulation will play an important role, in my opinion, in defining the level of safety that need to be complied with by the trajectory. For example, the accuracy that you have to have that may impact the sizing of the 4D zone, because the 4D zone for sure will assume that the vehicle or vehicles remain within them with a certain level of probability and confidence. And these figures should be defined by the regulation. Another important aspect in that respect would be the interface between ATM and STM. Because, for example, the launch window will be typically communicated by the STM, but the STM will communicate the launch window based on a collision avoidance probability, and that figures again has to be shared and agreed with the ATM in order to be confident that in space and in the airspace, we are aligned with the level of safety. So these are aspects that must be taken into account and regulated very well.
Okay. One other development which you touched on was the advent of supersonic and hypersonic aircraft. Marco, that's obviously something that NASA have been working on closely with you in terms of research. How imminent is the arrival of this into the equation?
Oh, thanks for this question. It's a very interesting one. The discussion on the role of hypersonics goes back several decades. Maybe I would like to mention the so-called Orient Express under the Reagan administration, and also work performed in Europe with under our contracts of the European Space Agency, but also national level, like OTOL in the UK and Sanger in Germany and so on. I should say that there has been a lot of attention to concepts involving high-speed air breathing, hypersonics, because I would like to make the difference in the US language. When we talk hypersonics, we talk of vehicles that are cruising at high speed in the atmosphere, not the hypersonic reentry, because also when our capsules come back from space, they go through an hypersonic regime, but usually this is not called as hypersonic flight since it's just going through. And the application of high-speed air breathing systems, which would therefore require flying longer in the atmosphere, has been considered very much in the US and also Europe. But at the moment, this has not found yet, at least in space, an application because, first of all, of the large investments required in technology, but also because the attention of the space activities, at least at the government level, is moving more toward outer space, high energy orbits, Moon and then Mars. And of course, that there is little an air breathing vehicle could do for supporting exploration. So by definition, the air breathing is related to operations in very low orbits. And of course, that could be envisaged in terms of assembly in low Earth orbit of infrastructures that could be moved later on. For example, imagine a mission to Mars that would require hundreds of tons of hardware to be put in orbit. And there could be shuttle type, I mean, I don't mean space shuttle, but vehicles going for and back to low Earth orbit that could be also based on air breathing. But the main application is certainly commercial, and I think will be driven first by point-to-point transport, but also military.
Okay. Dragos, could you just talk a little bit? You touched on the whole problem of debris and space re-entry and coordination. Could you expand just a little bit in terms of how we need to coordinate a bit better on that?
I think that's a crucial question that states have started to ask more and more. We had in past experience, or we had to make decisions: do we or do we not close the airspace over Europe due to space debris or uncontrolled re-entries? It emerges that we need to have a standard methodology to assess this risk. I think this is where we need to work with colleagues from the space domain to make sure that this is transparent and understood, because the decision-making process needs to be well understood and applied consistently by states and everybody involved in there. Otherwise, a cascading effect with not well-prepared procedures will have a massive disruptive effect on our network. The second scenario, where we have launches that could actually have a non-nominal event and you have this space debris, it's again a situation where we need to prepare our response. We need to have predefined scenario. We need to be able to integrate space data into our aviation system such that when we go into tactical mode to prevent debris from hitting traffic or third parties, we need to be able to act in a window that I think experience has showed we need to be in between 5 and 10 minutes. That's the goal. That's where you need to get. That's what Echo to Prototype aims to deliver to the community.
Okay. So I see we're coming to the end of our time. So what I'd like to give each of you is an opportunity for a 1-minute wrap up to think about one thing that you can identify would make a difference in your particular domain. What would you like to see if you had your wish list? I'll start with Giovanni.
If I have to choose, I will choose to, let me say, recommend or highlight the urgency to operate as soon as possible and to deploy as soon as possible operations on the European territory based on regulation, possibly starting with national regulation that will evolve in the future to a regional and international regulation, but starting to regulate from the experience and from the data.
Okay. Marcos?
Yes, from my point of view, looking at the evolution of space toward commercial activities, which has very much a lot of attention and a lot of hope, I would say that what is needed is a clear and recognized strategy, for example, at the level of the European states, guaranteeing stability of plans, and a commitment by the governments to use certain services, which would then serve as an enabling factor for the commercial world.
Okay. And Dragos, the last word is yours.
I'll cheat a bit, and in my one wish, I would actually pack 3 in there. I would love
wishes.
to. I'd like to have the global cooperation process in place. I'd like to see the contingency management operating, and the airspace planning process between for launch and recovery and re-entry a reality. To me, these are fundamental blocks that would make Europe a global competitor, and I think it's important to get them right. Last but certainly not least, if I may, a fourth is basically saying give a chance to industry to be as ambitious as possible and make sure they can deploy their most advanced technology in higher airspace, so that we have this wonderful feature being brought to us in the short in a short while. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so it only remains for me now just to thank our panelists for a fascinating conversation. It's really been a very interesting debate. I certainly learned a great deal about it, a lot of stuff that I didn't know. So again, thank you very much for that. So I'd just like to say to everybody online, thank you for joining us on this Friday afternoon, and stay tuned for our next webinars, and we look forward to hearing from you soon at Eurocontrol. Thank you very much.
Thank you.